Welcome everybody to our webinar this week. Today's topic is why you need to say no to GMOs. GMOs are safe. Wait, no, they're not. What do I believe? The world is filled with information more than any single person could ever absorb in 100 lifetimes. The problem is, in our digital social media world, information is not always what it appears to be. There are opinions that people give as facts. There are facts that are completely taken out of context so that they appear to support a fiction. And then there are outright lies and misinformation that are meant to either reassure you or make you so confused that you give up trying to find out the actual truth. This presentation is going to present some basic facts so that you can make an informed choice on whether you want to eat GE, genetically engineered foods. And just FYI, GE and GMO can be used interchangeably. So a few starter facts. Humans have been practicing agriculture for well over 12,000 years. The commercial use of genetic engineering in crops is only 25 years old. It began commercially with the Flavor Saver tomato, which went on sale in the spring of 1994. Fact, GE crop production has skyrocketed. 90 times more land is under GE production than even just 20 years ago. Yet across the planet in 2017, GE crops were farmed in only 24 countries, and only 5 of the 39 most developed countries allow genetically engineered crops to be grown. Yet 41% of all the acreage worldwide planted with GMO crops is here in the US. So the question is, why are we one of only 5 developed countries to allow genetically engineered foods, and why do we produce so much of it? And that's the answer. It's a lot of money. So how were GMOs determined to be safe? Before they ever hit the supermarket shelves or factory livestock farms back in the 80s, 2 things happened. The Reagan administration decided that biotech foods did not present any new risks to the consumer, so no new laws were needed to test GMO foods. This was decided by someone who was not a scientist. Second, the FDA decided that the final genetically engineered product did not, quote unquote, vary significantly from the original, and therefore they didn't need to regulate them. So this is something interesting. People assume the FDA regulates GE foods. They do not. What this means is this leaves GMO manufacturers the power to label any of their products as GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. This is like a guideline that tells somebody you don't have to worry if you eat this, it won't make you sick. So how can the manufacturers do that? Because GRAS determination is decided by the manufacturer that created the ingredient or product, which is a blatant conflict of interest. This means that they have no obligation to conduct long-term safety studies. Since the seed companies are able to patent GE foods, researchers have little or no access to the GMO seeds for independent safety testing. This is a huge issue, obviously. So let's talk about the safety of GMO foods. And one of the biggest things we hear is that, well, obviously the FDA allows them. I think a lot of people think the FDA oversees them. They don't really oversee them, but they allow them. So one of the lies that's consistently told is that the FDA did do research and discovered no potential issues at all with genetically engineered or genetically modified organisms, crops, and animals. But in reality, FDA scientists repeatedly warned the FDA that GM foods can create unpredictable, hard to detect side effects, including allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They urged long-term safety studies, but they were ignored. There was a lot of money that exchanged hands at that point. So is the USDA covering up for Monsanto? In the US, Monsanto is by far and away the leader of GE food production. So agency scientists tell the Watchdog Group that research is suppressed when it upsets agrochemical interests. Scientists submitting works on neonicotinoids, I can never get that word right, or the long-term effects of GMO crops trigger corporate complaints, and then they find that the scientists' careers are in jeopardy. Your words are changed, your papers are censored or edited, and you are not allowed to even submit them at all, says a senior scientist who asked not to be named. This is really the issue. Scientists do not have the power in the FDA. The main body of the FDA are doctors who over 80% currently have direct money ties to the very companies they're supposed to oversee. We talk a lot about the FDA with drug companies, but it's equally true with agrochemical companies. So the scientific truth is really just on a downhill roll because money has power and apparently science right now does not. So how are GMOs created? There are two methods that are currently used to produce them. Each relies on changing only one specific gene. So let's take a look at what a gene is when you look at the entire genome, chromosome, and that whole situation, so to speak. So if you look at my cursor, this is your cell, and your nucleus contains your genetic material. The genetic material is all contained in something called a chromosome. And in each part of the chromosome is something called a solenoid loop, which is a very, 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 very tightly looped protein-based structure that contains something called nucleosomes. Nucleosomes contain the information of how your environment and body is interacting with your genetic material. And the nucleosomes cover the histones. And the histones are the spindles around which your DNA is wrapped. So your DNA is wrapped around a histone, and your histone is wrapped around with beads of nucleosomes, and the nucleosomes are wrapped into very tightly looped strands that completely cover the DNA itself. Histones are one of the two main ways that your body turns DNA on and off. Histones are completely responsible for suppressing genetic material that's not functioning correctly or suppressing disease-making material that might be in your genetic makeup and activating genetic material that is appropriate to your life. 100% histones and then something called methylation determines the activity of your DNA. And then your gene is several loops of DNA, typically four. 4 loops of DNA equals a gene. So I want us to really look at this. Here is what is going to be changed. But the histones are not researched. The nucleosomes are not researched. The solenoid loops are not researched. So the majority of how your genetic material is going to interact in your body is completely bypassed during the process of genetically modifying an organism. The process of creating GMOs is risky. Here's a foreign gene or something that the scientists in an agrochemical company, I should say, have determined is something they want in a plant or an animal. There's 2 ways and only 2 ways currently that they modify the actual genetic material of the original plant. One is through a bacteria, where they take a gene, they put it in a bacteria, and they mix the bacteria with plant cells, and then I'll talk about that process. Eventually, it changes that plant material, and then all these cells are screened to make sure the transgene, the new gene, got through. So if there was 1 million that didn't make it through and 1 that did, even if the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 that it was not a good thing, that's the 1 cell that they clone to make the new plant. The other way is called a gene gun, and I'm going to talk about that right now, because to me this is utterly unbelievable. So they take that new gene and that genetic material, which is a series of proteins, and they stuff it in a barrel of a gene gun. And then at the bottom of the barrel of the gene gun is a plastic disc that is coated with DNA gold particles coated with DNA. So here's your gene gun. Your DNA has been coated onto gold particles. There's a screen, so the disc can't go through, but a burst of energy blows out this genetic gold material into plant cells, And again, then they search for the plant cell that has the new material, pull it out of the rest of the plant, and clone it to make a brand new genetically modified organism. If you use the bacterium, how that works is they edit it using something called the CRISPR technique. So let's take a look at that. So they look for a sequence of DNA in the plant that's similar to the DNA they want to put in the plant. It's not exact, or it wouldn't need to be replaced, right? So, but it's similar. So once they find a genetic sequence that's similar, then they put it into a cell with a protein that's called Cas9, which is like a scissor. It's an enzyme scissor. And what it does is this scissor cuts out the original DNA in the plant, replaces it with the new DNA, and now new enzymes repair the cut. So they've basically forced a whole different piece of DNA into a plant in a place where it looks similar, but all of the hundreds or thousands of interactions that that DNA may have had in that plant, they have no idea about because they have not tested for that. So what about safety today? Well, we can be pretty assured that acute issues like you're going to drop dead after you eat GM corn, they aren't really happening, or we would hear about it. But there is a very real concern with the chronic and long-term side effects of using GE crops. This picture just blows me away. This is transgenic rice. This is genetically modified rice. And I want you to take a look at how these guys are attired. I would understand having a breathing mask on. You know, breathing in dust of anything is not healthy. So having a mask is appropriate. But they aren't just masked. They are completely covered as though this were a toxic material, because it potentially is. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to eat it. Obviously, we are. But it's so unsafe that workers have to be completely covered up to work with it. So let's look at some of the long-term issues. We know our genetic expression is dependent on the actions of histones. I talked about that. That's what your epigenetic does. The histones working with your genes. Since histones are a part of the integral structure that surrounds the gene, changing the gene will dramatically affect the histone activation and silencing actions. Now, what we eat affects our histones and our DNA, therefore our DNA expression. And this is proven that what we eat affects our DNA expression via our histones. But because we eat not just the changed gene, but the entire genetic chromosomal information in every plant, that disrupted epigenetic potential disaster has the potential to disrupt our epigenetic process and make us ill over time. So how are potential risks to human health determined? Human health risk to unfamiliar foreign proteins, which typically are allergic reactions. And of course, DNA is 100% protein. So that's a concern. Genes resistant to antibiotics. That is something that occurs in genetically engineered foods. But this means that it's possible that diseases could be transmittable to humans because the genetic material was resistant to an antibiotic, so the disease survived. Some carcinogenic properties causing cancer. We know that that is certainly possible with an epigenetic expression that is not accurate or functioning correctly. Toxic compound, such as glyphosate and Roundup, is harming development in children and adults. That's proven now. One of the genetically modified foods that's gotten a lot of press is called golden rice. And it's a rice with more beta carotene, and it's meant to supposedly help with the beta carotene imbalance that people have, and they're going blind, you know, in poor countries. The problem is that it has a lot of a protein called xanthophylls. And xanthophylls by themselves can be toxic. The rice also has less glutamine, which is a rice protein that balances a different protein called proclaim, which turns into an allergen if those two proteins aren't balanced. So they've created a rice that has more beta carotene, but at some pretty severe risks to the integrity of the entire seed, the rice seed. There are ethical concerns for some people. The money cost approbation, you have to pay more for genetically engineered crops. They are antibiotic resistant, which is not good for any of us. And they are weed resistant, which frankly is not good for us because a healthy soil will have a variety of organisms in it, including plants. So let's look at actual studies that were done. This is from PubMed. The results of most studies with GM foods indicate that they may cause some common toxic effects, such as hepatic, which is your liver, pancreatic, renal, or your kidneys, or reproductive effects, and may alter the hematological, your blood, biochemical, and immunologic parameters. In other words, it can disrupt your liver, your pancreas, your kidneys, your reproductive organs. It can alter your blood, your biochemical makeup, and your immune system. That's a lot of stuff. This is from Greece. Obviously not the US, sad to say. So one of the biggest genetically engineered changes is to use the Bt toxin. Bt is a type of bacteria that has been used as a natural insecticide since the 1920s via a topical application. And in fact, it's approved for organic farming because it is completely natural. It's a bacteria that helps reduce pests. It's something I've used in my garden in the past. But genetically engineered foods with Bt toxins have them actually inserted into the plant DNA to supposedly reduce the susceptibility to pests. The problem is there's only 2 Bt crops that are actually even meant to work on pests, and this is corn and cotton. The majority of crops use putting Bt into the genetic material in order to make the plant non-susceptible to dying because of the application of an herbicide like Roundup. So they're using Bt toxin to keep the plant from reacting to poison. And then we eat the poison. But nonetheless, I have heard, well, if it's safe enough to use in organic gardening, why should I care about it if it's in the GE crop? And there's an answer. The DNA of each cell of Smart Stacks corn, which has Bt toxin in it, is that these Bt toxins don't wash off. They don't wear off, and the sunlight does not affect them. They are regulated with and registered by the EPA. They're that poisonous. Found in the blood serum of 93% of pregnant women and tested to be found in the cord blood of 80% of their unborn babies. What's really important is the toxin level produced by GMO Smart Stacks is 1,500 to 2,000 times higher than the registered application rate of Bt used in organic farming, which is only external. It's used only after other preventative, cultural, physical, and mechanical methods have been used and failed. Less than half of organic farmers report ever even using Bt toxins. It's applied topically, it washes off, and it breaks down in sunlight. So typically when you apply a Bt toxin, if you're an organic farmer, you apply it 1 to 2 weeks before harvest. It's water, and it's got sunlight, and it's completely broken down before harvest ever even occurs. So this is aggregate findings of over 60 GMO rodent feed studies. Now this is interesting. This is a compendium of research that has been slammed as completely wrong by the GM industry. Yet when I did some pretty extensive research trying to figure out why they said this study was not accurate, I could not find any details on why they said this was an inaccurate result, the aggregate finding. But what they found is that the stomach mucosal barrier was compromised. There's increased intestinal infections, hyperlipidemia, which is fat in the blood, higher blood glucose levels, lower birth weight, increased mortality of offspring, disturbances in the pancreas, liver, kidneys, adrenal glands, ovaries, testes, and thymus, disturbance in the immune system, blood biochemistry, the gut microbiota imbalance. As I said, this is something, if you do research, you'll see that it's proclaimed as an inaccurate result, but I could never find out why they said that. So that makes me a little suspect as to why it's supposedly inaccurate. Childhood leukemia. Exposure to pesticides is known to increase the risk of childhood leukemia, as well as other types of childhood cancer. New research links an impoverished gut microbiome and chronic inflammation with an increased risk of childhood leukemia. Glyphosate herbicides are used on around 90% of GM crops. Glyphosate has been classified as a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization's Cancer Agency. Exposure to glyphosate-based and other pesticides have been shown to disrupt the gut microbiome in laboratory animals. People who eat organic food have been found to have a 25% reduced risk of cancer. So clinical experience shows that switching to an organic and non-GMO diet improves people's health and has a potential to reduce childhood leukemia rates. This was written by a doctor. This is from his site. Let's take a look at gut health, because that study said, you know, it affects the gut microbiome. So this is pictures from a study, and you know what? Pictures don't lie. This picture on the left, number A, is a healthy small intestine. And you'll see there's the villi, and then there's the outer edges of the villi, and of course there'll be all of the bacterial colonies in the villi. There's a blood supply and the different kind of cells that you can see with the different colors of dye. This is the same animal and its microbiome, small intestinal microbiome, after eating GMO wheat. Excuse me, GMO corn, I apologize. Sorry, wrong on that, corn. And you can see the structures are flattened and just in general broken down. And the animals with this level of destruction did indeed become ill, and many of them died months earlier than their healthier counterparts. So that's your gut microbiome. But what's interesting is there are very similar results in the stomach. So this is a normal stomach lining, and you'll see, you know, there's acid that's going to be coming through, and a lot of work happens in the stomach, and you really need the stomach lining to be solid to protect yourself from the potential issues of having acid eating away your own tissues in your stomach, which is what an ulcer is. This is the same animal's stomach after eating GM crops. And you can see the stomach barrier is almost gone. And that translates to very poor digestion, which translates to long-term and ongoing chronic inflammation from the stomach onward. And I'd like to end by this quote. If the sight of the blue skies fills you with joy, if a blade of grass springing up in the fields has the power to move you, if the simple things of nature have a message that you understand, rejoice, for your soul is alive.